Jonathan Ervine from the School of Modern Languages at Bangor University in Wales. My interest in sport and protest stems from wider research interests of mine that concern contemporary France. I've always had a particular interest in how minority groups in France are represented. For example, immigrant groups, young people from suburban housing estates in France, and other different minorities. This initially concerned how immigrants and kids from areas known as the banlieue were portrayed in both documentary and fictional films, and it has broadened out to look at wider questions of a similar nature and how they affect discourses and debates surrounding French music, French comedy and French sport. Now, when I look at French sport, it's often in relation to questions to do with social cohesion and when cohesion and diversity is celebrated, and also when diversity and division is talked about in relation to sporting failures as opposed to successes. Now, if you look at the French context, the 1998 World Cup and the 2010 World Cup are symbols of two very different tendencies. In 1998, France hosted and won the Football World Cup with a side who featured many descendants of immigrants, players from different visible minorities and so on. At the time, this was seen as a symbol of a tolerant, modern and diverse France. This was the sort of line taken by leading French politicians at the time, such as Jacques Chirac, Lionel Jospin, or a lot of public intellectuals at France. However, if you fast forward to 2010 and the World Cup in South Africa, France had troubles off the field and on the field. And after their failure, it was seen as not just a sporting failure, but a sort of moral failure, a failure that symbolised in the views of a lot of right-of-centre intellectuals as a sign of not just what's wrong with modern footballers, but what's wrong with modern France. The behaviour or perceived bad behaviour of footballers who'd grown up in the banlieue, the suburban fringes of Paris. So diversity on one hand, it was a symbol of the 1998 team in a positive way, seen as a symbol of division with the 2010 team. So what a lot of this boils down to is what sport shows us about society and how society influences how sport is discussed in a range of different contexts. Now, today what I was discussing at this conference about sport and protest was the French footballer Nicolas Anelka, who is quite a controversial figure for a number of reasons. He's sometimes seen as arrogant. He's somebody who has had problematic relations with both the French media and also a number of French national team coaches. So Anelka, when we talk about protest, sometimes he's protesting, if that's the right word, at what he perceives as ill treatment by teammates or managers who he feels have not sufficiently respected him. A flashpoint I was discussing in my paper today concerned a gesture known as the Canal gesture that Anelka performed after scoring a goal for West Bromwich Albion in December 2013. This gesture is associated with a controversial French comedian called Dieudonné, and there have been debates about this gesture. Is it an anti-system gesture, or is it a gesture that is actually anti-Semitic? And, as I argued, potentially it can be seen as both anti-system and anti-Semitic. What the challenge is with interpreting the Canal is the number of different ways in which it can be analysed. What were the intentions of the people who performed it, for example? Now, with Anelka, one of the challenges is there's a degree of ambiguity here. He hasn't always given a full explanation for certain moments of controversy in his career, and he hasn't given a very detailed explanation of why he considers the Canal to be anti-system rather than anti-Semitic, and exactly what sort of system he was reacting against when he gave this gesture. Now, in a wider sense, I'd say this gesture is a symbol of how sport and protest can be ambiguous and complicated at an age when traditional left-right boundaries in politics are perhaps less well defined as they once were. Certain gestures of sporting protest, such as the iconic Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico, it is clear that they are identifying with a specific protest movement, such as the civil rights movement in the US, with the case of the Black Power salute. However, the Canal gesture performed by Anelka is much more ambiguous, much more complicated, at an age where we perhaps don't see people referring to the same sort of political and social reference points in an increasingly individualist and perhaps consumerist worlds, which is affected by capitalism, neoliberalist agenda, and so on, which means that in Elka, on one hand, it may be hard to interpret the canal gesture, but on the other hand, perhaps it should be seen as a sort of individual act of protest and a symbol of the complicated nature of relations between sport and protest, and what we can even call a protest gesture today.